I'm the host of the Retrogaming podcast, and with me is our panel of interviewers. So let's go down the line and introduce ourselves. This is Zach. What's up, Zach?
Hey, what's up, man?
I'm here in Phoenix with Zach, and then Sean.
Hi, my name is Jenovi. I run a show called Retro Impressions, which focuses on gaming history from the 80s up through the late 90s.
Cool.
And then we have Candi.
Hello, thank you for sharing your time with us today. I run a YouTube channel called Candi's Classic Game Shrine. I cover basically anything from the Atari era on up. My personal favorite is misunderstood systems like the Virtual Boy.
Cool.
Okay, so
Started out very pleasant. It's we've got my coffee, and I'm about to have my first pipe.
excellent. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Speaking of smoking, one of our users asked, do you still partake in the smoking of cannabis or anything of that nature?
You know, it's funny. Atari had a somewhat cannabis culture, but I never got into it. My drink of choice is a martini, and I find that the cannabis for me is not pleasant. Occasionally I'll do some CPD to help sleep. That's about it.
Cool. So that takes care of our first user question. So our next question is, what was it like launching Computer Space? So there wasn't a coin-op arcade industry. You had other coin-op toys, but you didn't have the video arcade industry. What was it like founding that whole industry with Computer Space?
You know, it was really, I didn't think it was that remarkable at the time, believe it or not.
I believe it.
It was in college, I worked in amusement park summers, and I had an arcade that I was responsible for. And so I knew the economics of the coin-operated game business. I knew how much they cost. I knew how much they had to earn. And so I just saw the video game as being a cheaper, better way of entertainment.
It is definitely, I think, a better way of providing entertainment. Now, in those first years, when you were before 2600, before the computer system, in those first years, and during the first generation, who did you see as your biggest competitors? Only 4 companies, including Atari. Only 3 of your competitors continued after that first generation, but who did you worry about?
I worried really about Bally and Williams. They were the big dogs on the block.
Now in the home, so that's on the arcade side.
Correct.
Now on the home console side, in the Pong industry, who did Atari worry about there once you guys had home systems coming out?
I worried about everybody.
Yeah.
Only the paranoid survive. And I think that I always felt like that Atari was a little bit of a poser in some ways. Like, we were a small company in this world of behemoths, and I always felt that we could be stepped on by any of these big companies because we never had enough money. We never had huge, efficient factories. We were making it up as we go along, and so our attitude was that our only skill set really was a better understanding of games and a better ability to innovate. And so innovate was really our ultimate skill set, and that ultimately allowed us to be great. Also, I used business really as a game, and I used to say it's the ultimate game, and you keep score with money. But I would play business and I would often play against the people who are running the competitive business. And I would head fake them and give them, and probably the smartest thing I did was there were only 4 sources for N-channel MOS in 1976, 77. And so I basically did contract with every one of them to do my next generation chip on an exclusive basis. And so nobody, the only one that I couldn't get a deal with was IBM, because they just didn't want to do it. But I got all the rest of the guys to sign up. And that essentially blocked anybody from competing with the 2600. And after I sold the company to Warner, and after a few years, the guys looked at the fact that I had these 3 other contracts out, and we were paying them a de minimis amount of money, maybe 50 grand a year, to develop the next chip.
Yeah.
They said, that's silly to have 3 of them. They canceled 3 of them, or 2 of them, keeping just 1. And those 2, one of them went to TI, the other one went to Mattel. No, there were 3. And so they canceled. And so our chip designs that were being done by the other guys actually fostered the competition that happened in 1982, 83.
So you paid for the research and development.
Yeah, I mean, it was
television.
You did the grunt work.
Yeah, the Warner guys didn't understand the technology. They were all marketing guys. They were all from record companies, and so they were clueless about technology strategic planning. And so they created their own downfall.
So let's talk about that then. So a lot of people think that the downfall and the crash was a direct result of the lack of planned obsolescence on Atari's part. Back now at this point, Warner would be in control of Atari by not phasing out the 2600 and introducing a replacement console sooner. So did you have a plan for planned obsolescence at the time?
Absolutely. Well, it was less planned obsolescence as it was that the technology was changing so quickly at the time that a game that you could start, the game that you could design concurrently was so much better and more powerful than what you were in production with. And so you had to get, you sort of had to eat your own babies in order to be good. For example, the 2600 only had 128 bits or bytes of memory, 128 bytes. Innocently small because memory was very expensive. And so by the time we were actually in market, the cost of memory had dropped 3 orders of magnitude. For the same amount of money for that 128 bits, we could have had 3, 4 kilobits. And that gave you a chance to do a line buffer and, all kinds of fun stuff that would really have made the games better.
So what exactly would have been your course of action had you stayed on board with Atari through to the 80s versus what happened? And do you believe that you could have averted the eventual crash that came in 82?
I know I could have. My big disagreement with Warner is I felt we had to get a brand new unit out by 1980, 1981. At latest, maybe even 79. Because remember, 77, 78, 79 took us about 2 years to get a new console into the market at the time. And we could have had essentially a game that was equivalent to the Nintendo Famicom in 1979. And the Nintendo Famicom didn't happen until 1985.
85 in the US, but 83 in Japan.
Correct.
And so Was there anything on the board, or did Warner just quash all plans for a follow-up system at that time while you were there?
Quashed all plans. And if you really look at what they did, once they realized that they needed to do it, they just took the Atari
800
computer and redid it into the 5200. But the computer didn't have the right architecture to be a really good game system.
Yeah, and you talked a lot about innovation and design, and the 5200 definitely didn't have a lot of innovation in design, especially in its controller. We were just talking about that.
Worst controllers in the world. Worst controllers in the world.
It was, well, yeah, definitely one of the worst. But speaking to innovation and design, while you were there, were any of your competitors, did they ever innovate anything that you said, aha, man, I wish that we had done this first?
There was only one game that I thought was pretty cool, and it was one by Williams in the coin-op side that was called, it had like I think it was called Gunslinger. You know, it had a shooter on each side, cactuses and a down. I think it was. God, I'm getting old. Yeah, it was
I have a friend that wanted to know about early games for the 2600, and if you recall who worked on them. Specifically, he's wondering about Space War, and if you knew who the author of it was.
Say again? The
Space War.
Space War was done by a guy named oh shoot. He was from MIT, Kurt Russell. Not Kurt Russell. Steve Russell.
Steve Russell.
Yeah. Very, very smart man. Atari later on hired him because he had a really good game sense. He did that in believe it or not, 1963.
Yeah, he also asked me, he says, when you're putting together the Nova Space War at Ampex, where did you get the Space War program for? Larry Bryan only made the time sharing, correct?
Right. We didn't get it at Ampex. I got it at the AI lab at Stanford. And I had a good friend that I played Go with that was was a graduate student at Stanford and worked at the AI lab.
Any memories about Grand Track 10 or Tank?
Oh, great memories. Grand Track 10 had a hybrid in it, and it almost bankrupted the company because we got delayed and couldn't ship, and we had all these Grand Track 10s. We had also mispriced it, so that it was costing us more, so that we didn't get our regular margin. And as a result, that we discontinued Grand Track 10 and moved immediately to Track 10, which was a cheaper version but played the same game.
I want to ask about the name Video Computer System. There's a rumor that's been going around the internet for years that the name was purposely derived to confuse consumers about Fairchild's video entertainment system, so VES versus VCS. So I wanted to ask, is there any truth to that? And how did the name come about?
You know, I literally don't remember how the name came about. It was a thing where I think that all I know is that 2600 had to do with the custom chip that we had to use. Mm-hmm. And so it really had its genesis in the engineering world. Yeah. You know, which was something that was strange because, you know, the marketing guys always thought the nerds ran the company, which was kind of true.
But no truth to the idea that Video Computer System was purposely picked to do one over up on Fairchild as a name.
We never thought of Fairchild as being a serious competitor. I know that sounds funny, but we just we just knew that they didn't have the chops to be. I mean, the game business is rough and tumble, and Fairchild at the time was very corporate.
Yeah, this is a semiconductor company, and you guys were a video game company, so I can see how you wouldn't take them seriously because they weren't a serious game. They weren't a serious game developer,
And quite frankly, their games weren't very fun. And you know, if a game isn't fun, it's not great. I mean, I think they had one game that was playable, but most of it was.
Yeah, I have a full set over here, and I've all but one game for it, and there's only about 4 or 5 games in there that are like pretty good.
Yeah.
And the rest of them are, as you said, they're just kind of so games that aren't really. I mean, one of them is, you know, Slot Machine. I mean, that's not the most fun game in the world. Even in real life, at least you can win money without the risk part. Who wants to play it? I mean, I guess my grandmother on her, you know, handheld, like electronic LCD system, right?
Yeah.
Going back,
Well, you're on the VCS name. I think it's a perfect opportunity to ask about your opinion on the new Atari recycling that name for their system.
You know, I don't even follow the new Atari. I hate to say that, so I just don't do it.
I don't think you want to at this point.
well, you're on the board, correct?
No, I used to be.
So they released a press release that said that you're a board member.
Who?
Atari SA.
No, I was a board member 6 years ago.
Okay, so it's old information.
Yeah, but you know, watching Atari right now is just too painful for me.
I understand.
As a fan of Atari, it hurts. I can only imagine as the father of Atari how much it hurts.
Yeah.
Did you feel that way during the 80s and 90s watching the 7800 come out and the Jaguar and the Lynx, or did you play those too?
Yeah, I did. The Lynx wasn't bad. I thought
No, it's a great little system.
I played it too.
Had vanishingly short battery life. But
It should just be in a home console.
Yeah.
yeah. But
What are you playing these? Did you still play games? Are you playing anything these days?
oh yeah, in fact, I was just playing a game of Go online. I still play Go. I still play a lot of games. I'm actually I've got a little game company that I'm doing right now that called X2, and it's it's actually kind of an interesting game. It was acquired by a blockchain company in a reverse merger, so we're actually now a Canadian public company. So, you know, one of the things you should tell your fans to go out and buy. It's a penny stock. I mean, it's like 3 cents a share, and the ticker symbol is BLKCF.
BLKCF.
Yeah.
We're all gonna go out and buy some pennies worth and get rich.
So what kind of games are you working on?
We're doing a series of games that are this will sound funny. They're board games that are Alexa mediated. So Amazon Echo has very, very good voice technology and an installed base of about 100,000. And so what we decided is it'd really be fun to do a board game that now had, you know, a secret, and you could converse with it, and sound effects and music. And so we have a game right now that'll be out probably in about a month that's called Think Noir, which is like Clue, but you interrogate the townspeople and you can ask them programmatic questions, and they answer in their voice. So the bartender, who's the floozy, and the school teacher, and the sheriff, and all that. And what you're doing is you're finding out all the suspects have to tell the truth, but the perpetrator can lie. And so the game is about figuring out who's lying.
It sounds like so it's a mystery.
It's a mystery.
Yep, make sure you send us some links and information that we can include in the description of the interview when we post it.
I'd like that. I'll do that.
Yeah,
Yeah, that'd be great.
really fun
It's
project.
X2 Games. Go into x2.games.com. Or no, x2.games, period.
That sounds great. I have a question for you that I feel kind of connects to that in some way, and that's your involvement with the Pieces of Time Theater.
You're right.
And I was curious, was that always intended to be how it was, or did you actually intend for it to eventually have a video game manufacturing arm?
Well, when I sold Atari, I signed a non-compete for 7 years. And when the 7 years was up, I was planning to get back into the coin-op manufacturing business. And so I did. And the coin-op side was called Sente, S-E-N-T-E, which is also a Go word.
Yeah.
And we did several games, and then we ultimately ended up selling that to Midway.
Now, you also did a company called Axon, and you did some late releases on 2600, including one of my favorite, which is Off the Wall.
Yeah.
And Axon was also involved in Project Nemo or Control Vision, working with Hasbro.
That's correct.
How hands-on were you in that project?
Pretty hands-on in the beginning, and then I put it off to other involved at that time in robotics. Very involved, and Androbot was kind of where my bandwidth was being used.
How come? Do you know why what is there anything in that system that you wish that came to light that hasn't come to light yet?
Well, the essence of the game, of the system, was to up the amount of information for background. So the idea was that you played the game with a videotape,
Right.
and it would grab screens and do things, and it was actually a complex editing process. My disagreement with them, they did a couple of games,
Night Trap, Stewart Sharp.
but I always felt that the cost of that, of doing live action and making it seamless and do all the edits correctly, was too expensive. And I felt they should have just to animation. And what they did is they drove up the cost of production so high that Hasbro got scared and canceled the whole project.
I'm sure you're familiar with the Bandersnatch that's released on Netflix.
Oh yeah.
How heavily inspired is that by technology like the Nemo and the eventual games that were developed for that hardware and released other places? And do you feel like they kind of really lifted a lot of those concepts? And do you even consider that a game?
Well, no, I absolutely consider it a game.
I do too.
And you know, I believe that we all stand on each other's shoulders. So lifting ideas, I think it's all about an execution game. And I thought they executed Bandersnatch quite well. And in fact, I'm working on one. It's called Conundrum right now.
Yeah.
And but we're going to be using the interface of Alexa, of Amazon Echo, as the user interface. So instead of using a controller, all you have to do is yell at your TV. Don't trust him. Check out this thing more.
This is what I'm talking about, because I've been saying for years now that it's time for FMV games to start coming back, and we've started to see more and more FMV style games coming popular. But now we're actually starting to see new technology applied to it, and I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. Oh, I might add, X2 is doing another game. This is a mobile, and you play Fortnite, and you play Trivia HQ. I'm sure, maybe. Anyway, if Trivia HQ and Fortnite had a baby, it would be Extra Riches, which is our game, which is a treasure hunt. You fly over an island, you land on the island, and you search for treasure, and you get to keep whatever treasure you find. It's at time specific, like Trivia HQ, and you can only search the island for 5 minutes. And we think that it's going to do some really great stuff, because
Go ahead.
you can find treasure maps and various things to help you find good treasure, and there's a lot of non-player characters that are going to harass you. It's going to be a fun game.
What kind of positive effects do you think that video games have on the player?
Oh, I think that cognitive ability of problem solving is definitely enhanced by video games. The only concern I have is that I feel like if you play too much video games, you're not getting basic knowledge as well. I mean, there is not a single good game programmer or good programmer of any type that didn't cut their teeth on video games. And it's that process, that learning how to do procedural generation problem solving, that is the core of being a good programmer. And so that's a good thing. But I think that today, most millennials that I talk to today have a vanishingly poor understanding of business and finance and accounting. And those are really good skill sets to have. And they're not that hard to pick up. I mean, it's about as easy to learn accounting as it is to learn Unity. And you need both of them.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt about that. I think a lot of games teach those skills with money management. My son plays, a lot of Madden, and you have to make a budget and you have to draft players.
Right.
And so I'm glad to see those skills, even if they're not taught well in public education, being funneled down.
Public education is destroying itself. It is so bad in so many parts of the country, actually the world.
Yeah.
I think our schools are crappy. Boy, in Asia, the drill and practice and some of the things, it's surprising they have any creativity left at all. And the other thing is that colleges have become, I think, a total waste of time and money. I mean, my sons, I have 8 kids, which is perhaps excessive, but my boys who decided not to go to college are doing better than the ones that went to college. And so it's really funny because they're entrepreneurs. They got their own companies and they're doing well. Anyway.
Well, that's really good to hear. Yeah, it's becoming an economy where a lot of jobs require even a degree in something just to get past the screening, the computerized screening. So I really think it's interesting. So if you're going to start a company, you definitely don't need it. But if you want to go work for a company, you might just get bounced out the door if you don't have that part of the paper.
Not Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley doesn't even ask you anymore.
Yeah, I believe that too. It's a different culture than
a
lot of the rest. of the country, and even where I'm at, I'm just in Phoenix, and so that's not very far away. The Laughing Cat 2 asks, what are your thoughts on location-based games such as those from your son Brent's 2-Bit Circus? Do you have any favorite examples?
Well, it turns out that my son, my youngest son, Wyatt, built two of the games that are the highest earning at 2-Bit Circus. So it's kind of a little bit of a family enterprise as well. And 2-Bit Circus is just knocking it out of the park right now. And it's going to make Chuck E. Cheese look like like a kid's toy. Yeah. And I love it when my kids outperform me.
Yeah, of course.
That's the dream of every father.
That is the dream. As soon as my son does better than me, I'm just going to retire.
Yeah, I mean,
We can all agree on that.
not just that. Remember that you someday we're going to want to be at Sunny Acres rather than the old folks' home.
I'll give you a high five for that one as well. All right, so let's see. Our next user question comes from Spoochie. He wants to know, I'm going to read this exactly as he wrote it. He says, quote, did the Mafia, I mean the Friendly Coffee and Jukebox Vending Corporation in Chicago, really pull a gun on you at dinner when you were trying to expand Pong at bars in the Midwest?
No, they actually didn't. Well, there was a bulge in the pocket.
You sure he just wasn't happy to see you?
And yeah, right. But it was a thing where the problem for Atari was never, ever on the street level. And the big problem was that the old guard didn't know how to repair video games. And the idea of replacing circuit boards was anathema to them. And that was the biggest problem. They didn't know quite what to think of it.
Mr. Bushnell, would you find it appropriate for an adult to go to Chuck E. Cheese?
Actually not.
Okay.
And the reason for that is it's a kid's place, and there are creepy people
That is true.
who want to be around kids. And we actually, there's a rule that says no adults without children. Now,
That's actually a really good rule. I like that.
yeah, and we originally instituted that because we didn't want teenagers,
That's also a very good idea.
because little kids and teenagers are non-admissible.
That is perfect. And a follow-up to that, how do you feel about unintentionally creating one of the world's most popular game series of the past decade, Five Nights at Freddy's, with all the animatronic characters and everything?
I think, the old story is like me, hate me, but don't forget me. Like in Ready Player One, the bad guy was named Nolan. And Ernie Klein told me, he said, I had to use your name somewhere. And I felt that it had to be a significant character. But I didn't mean to say that you were going to be an evil guy.
Andy,
Oh.
go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Rob.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, speaking of inspiring things, are you aware that you've inspired an entire game-related series that's called Code Monkeys?
I haven't. I've been. Somebody's told me I should take a look at that, but I haven't.
Oh, you really should. It's so funny, especially the first few episodes. Unfortunately, they use the Waz instead of you representing Atari, but how they've included a lot of the switch over to Warner and everything, I just found it way too funny.
I'll do it. Is it on Netflix or YouTube?
Unfortunately, it's really difficult to get a hold of. I've been able to find it on DVD, only the first season. And if you go on dailymotion.com, they'll have it the whole season.
Cool. Okay.
And it's all done in like 8-bit graphics, like a video game. It's quite funny.
Nothing like 8-bit graphics.
You said you do or you don't?
No, I haven't seen it. I love 8-bit graphics.
What are some of your favorite games of all time, and what are some of the most inspirational games or influential games you've ever experienced?
I always liked Asteroids a lot. I like Breakout a lot, and I like Tempest a lot. Tempest, to me, though, was very wrapped up in the technology. Tempest used some really difficult technology. It was the vector graphics, and at the time, transistors didn't like high voltage. And in order to get color, you had to switch high voltage at high speed. And that was really hard. And so a lot of the times when you see a Tempest machine right now, unless it's been totally upgraded, it doesn't work because those transistors just gave up the ghost. And now transistors can ship. You can switch high voltage easily, but in those days it was a real bitch.
So what was your impression of the Vectrex when that shipped?
It wasn't really a death threat. It was just a they were concerned and they wanted to let me know that I had to be nice to everybody that was made.
Let's talk a little bit about how we preserve these classic games. So there's a bit of a debate in the retro gaming community on piracy versus preservation. How do you feel about people who download ROM files of Atari 2600 games and play them?
I feel like a lot of this stuff is I feel like you really don't have a problem with downloading stuff that's 20 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old. I mean, I think these companies get carried away with their rules and regulations, and let's just have fun.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good way to preserve, I think, and also it helps introduce, thousands and thousands of people who eventually to these games who eventually become consumers when you have flashbacks and things of that nature.
Yep.
Coming out. Nolan, is there any big misconception about your time at Atari or your involvement with the company or you personally that you've seen repeated that you'd like to address?
Oh, I think there was a lot of talk about the cannabis use at Atari and my use, and
Yes,
and that it was not something that I did, and something that I don't do now. And the other part about it is we had a real meritocracy, and we were the very first people to do women's equal pay for equal work and treating women. Some of the ideas that we did certain businesses in hot tubs in today's world made it sound like we were sexist, but we weren't. I mean,
Yeah.
I think the GDC thing a couple of years ago really pissed me off.
Let me just interrupt and say, as a woman, that also pissed me off. A woman that's also part of the Me Too movement. I felt that was completely blown out of proportion. And honestly, I would have joined you in the hot tubs.
Well, we had parties, and a lot of the people would go home with each other, and it was all consensual, and there was no real complaints. and I just think that you know, looking at the 70s through the lens of the political act now is silly. But anyway,
Yeah, it was a different time and place.
I know
Yeah.
something.
Okay.
Ray Kassar is quoted as saying that when he showed up first at Atari, I had a T-shirt on that said, "I like to fuck."
Who doesn't?
No, but the fact that I would wear that kind of a T-shirt is silly. And more than that, I'd gotten married. I can, and if you knew my wife, the idea that I'd leave the house with that T-shirt on is about as absurd as anything else. and Ray Kassar hated me because I've been very forthright in saying that Ray Kassar destroyed Atari and destroyed the Atari culture, putting in, reserved parking spaces, which I thought was bad management.
That seems very pretentious.
Executive dining room and all that. And and I just thought he was a horrible person.
How did you really feel?
So he hated me. He hated me. People who are petty hate to be called out.
How long did it take you to see the value in both the software rather than hardware in the creators at Atari?
Oh, immediately. I knew the software was much more powerful than doing everything by hardware. But I also knew that you needed to push the hardware envelope just so that you'd have more pixels and better response time and be able to do a higher level of gameplay. For example, the artificial intelligence of non-player characters are impossible without software. You just couldn't do that in hardware and things like that.
Hey, I got a question. I think Rob would probably really appreciate this because we have this ongoing debate where I think me and him are on the same side and everybody else is on the other side. And that is where the first generation actually begins. And in my mind and in Rob's mind, it begins with the Magnavox Odyssey because there's no ROM chip. It's just all circuitry. With Pong really picking up Generation 2 or a generation onto its own. Do you feel like they are part of the same generation as they're often lumped together? Or do you feel like the Magnavox Odyssey is actually something that's completely separate outside of what Pong eventually became?
It's like the missing link.
I think that it was a very different thing. It was primarily an analog construct. It was a lot about RC time constants and things like that. Whereas Pong was all clocked digital. And so the architecture was vastly different.
So it's like comparing like a Model T Ford to a Ford Mustang, really.
Oh, no. It's like comparing a car to a horse and buggy.
There you go.
Yeah, well, it's it's interesting looking over the way that different historians lump together these consoles, and we always found it very peculiar that Pong is often lumped in with the Odyssey, and the Odyssey seems to be just such a different beast altogether. Oh, it's just that a lot of historians, it's very interesting how they lump together different hardware and consoles, and a lot of it makes sense. But when you look at Pong, it doesn't really seem to fit in with the Odyssey. The Odyssey is just such a different beast.
It doesn't fit in well with Odyssey.
Yeah, I think that's because if you look into the hardware, the analog way of creating time delay and placement on the screen, very, very, very different. Totally different.
Now, the first time you saw, Ralph Baer's invention, what was going through your mind at the time?
I was worried that I thought that I was the only video game guy in town.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden I see this game at the Burlingame Hilton or Marriott, and I looked at it and I said, "Oh, there's no competition here." But I noticed the other people around, they were kind of having some fun with it. And I thought, gee, no sound, no score. You can actually move the ball after you hit it. You can change the trajectory with the other little knob. It was a thing where I thought it was interesting that they were able to hit the price point that they did. It turned out Odyssey gave us some problems later on because they had a huge number of returns, people who bought it, and then Pong was in the bars when they bought the Odyssey. They came out, and they thought they were getting the Pong of bar that they were playing in bars for the home, and it wasn't even close. And so the retailers had a real bad taste in their mouth for the Odyssey. And so when we came with our consumer Pong, a lot of people said, "No, we tried that, and it was a failure."
Now, what of all the things that you've worked on and invented and created, do you still go back to and still use or still play?
Not much.
No?
Nope.
So that's good. It'll make it a short list.
There was a game that Sega made called Pong Tron. Supposedly came out in '73. Are you familiar with this? And if so, what's your opinion on it? I mean, as far as I know, no systems actually exist.
I've heard of it. I don't think I've ever seen it.
Why is it that Atari didn't see, during the second generation era, a lot of success in Europe or outside the United States? Was that because of the success of like the microcomputer industry overseas?
I don't know. We understand that Europe, the disposable income is a lot lower than in the United States. I mean, like a lot lower. And so the 2600 in Europe was very expensive. And I think that that's always been the problem. Cost.
Sure.
And there were some import duties as well that drove the cost up even more.
Yeah, plus you had to ship it across the big pond.
Yep.
I think that covers us for our user questions. I'm going to turn it over to our panel now. Panel?
Actually, a lot of the questions I had are pretty much covered.
Zach?
I heard a story that you told in an old interview about some kids who froze some discs and they found out the weight and size of a quarter and they put them in your machine. I wanted to hear about what sort of consequences those kids faced. Were you impressed or were you angry?
Oh, I was very impressed.
Okay.
I think I'm a little bit of an anarchist myself.
Yeah, I sort of sense that.
I appreciate a good hack.
Yeah.
What
I
are some
figured
other-
that was right up your alley.
What are some other things, hacks along those lines that you've seen during your time?
The early games could be triggered with static electricity. So people would do what I called the free game shuffle. Nylon jerseys rub up against each other, charge themselves up, touch a certain point on the coin mech, and get a free game.
That's amazing.
Wow, that's epic.
It was really funny. There was another one that, and how people figure this out, I don't know. But if you hit the third bolt down on the coin mech with something about the mass of a cue ball, you'd get a free game.
Because it just knocks the lever somehow?
Well, it set up some kind of vibration.
Yeah.
Things like that are really hard to figure out, how all of a sudden the counter is counted 300 coins, and there's only 25 in the box.
So how often did you guys like redesign that stuff, and like how many people did you have dedicated to doing that?
Perpetually. The other thing that what you did is we had a real problem, and it only happened in Nevada. And it turns out that a computer radiates on radio frequencies. And we were able to, one of our games in a particular bar would shut down the police radios.
Oh no!
And I think we were doing it all over, but because it was all over the place, they noticed that it would only happen during regular hours when the bar had closed, and all of a sudden the radios were good again. And that's how they tracked it down to one.
Wow.
All right, Nolan. Final question before you go.
Okay.
What's your favorite animal?
Oh, I think a dog. I've got 4 dogs, and I love them to death. And I hate them, too. They're just a pain in the ass.
Can definitely see and relate there.
Well, I mean, I think that dogs and children, you love them when you love them, and you hate them when you hate them.
Yep.
100%.
Oh my gosh.
Especially children.
Speaking of dogs, mine is now whining at my door.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I had a little kid who lives with me trying to come in while we're doing this interview. So, yep, life is such.
Your life is now with your kids. Make sure they have a lot of stuff to play with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Not stuff that you buy. You know, teach them, give them full access to a hot glue gun.
Oh, yeah.
Hot glue gun, with little kids, you can connect anything to anything else, and that instills some creativity because all of a sudden they can start building toys.
Yeah.
I hated to do this, but in Toy Story, you know, the guy who was taking the toys apart and doing everything,
Mhm.
I thought him as being really creative, and it should be encouraged.
That's all stuff that I would do as a kid. Maybe not as creepily as his, but yeah, no, I was always encouraged to use the soldering gun, the hot glue gun, get my hands dirty.
I think
I always tried to misuse toys.
exactly.
Turn everything into a gun or a weapon or something. Yeah, it's kind of a crazy little kid.
Yep.
I just took everything apart until I couldn't put it back together anymore.
Yep. Well, you know, the trick is you take something apart, put it back together, and you have parts left over. So
Exactly.
you keep taking it apart and putting it back together, and pretty soon you have enough parts for a whole nother system.
I think that's a good note to conclude things on. Nolan, you're the best, sir.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, man.
Appreciate
Good
your
day.
time. Have a blessed
Good day.
day.
We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.